And my role here tonight is a modest one of introducing one of our favorite citizens and somebody whose work we take a lot of pride in, even though we have very little to do with it. And that's Eric Liu, who's going to come up here and introduce something that's a little bit distinct from other bodies of work that we occasionally present around here. And that in itself, I think, is the beginning of an interesting conversation that, in fact, Eric and I have been having from time to time. Eric, as you may know, is a distinguished public intellectual and a man with a remarkably diverse career. He's been a speechwriter in the White House and a deputy director of domestic policy in the White House. He's also a writer and a thinker who has breathtaking range. He put together, how long ago was Next?
Oh, about 17 years ago.
17 years ago, when he was still young enough to be of sort of interest as a young cohort, to be young, he edited a group of essays that really tried to, I think you better describe it, but kind of counter-program some of the cliches about Generation X as that phrase first emerged. And then he wrote a book called The Accidental Asian that's part memoir and part reflection about race and identity in America, and that led then to Guiding Lights, which is a book about mentorship and teaching, broadly defined, a very powerful work organized around ideas that are partially visible in what we'll hear from him tonight. A commitment that Eric has, I think, as an intellectual to first principles and to values as an organizing framework for discussions of national life and national policy. And as we can tell as horse race watchers and spectators of this campaign, our politics, though it has many advantages, often suffers from the quality of discourse that competition produces. And even in the contextual worlds of institutions like ours, it's difficult sometimes to create a conversation about first principles, about values, about purpose, as an element of politics, of policy, of national identity. And that is, of course, where this country originated, however, and where many political projects worth talking about originated. And I think that this line in Eric's own body of work, his reflections about identity and national identity, his reflections and writing about purpose in Guiding Lights, take him quite naturally through to this project, which he's going to introduce tonight through the mechanism of a book that he's written with his partner, who couldn't be here tonight, Mick Hanauer, who's in Seattle tonight, and who I've had the pleasure of meeting when Eric and he came to town a few months ago. I'll let him describe what this book is and it isn't, but it is a return not only to a form of publishing that used to shape American discourse at the beginning of this experiment, but also to a set of values and frameworks and tones that I think are too rare in our national discourse. And it's a book event, a piece of publishing, but it's also the beginning of a process. And that is something that I think at New America we're very excited about, certainly very proud to be affiliated with. So I'll leave you with Eric Liu.
Thank you very much, Steve. I just want to say, Steve, listening to Steve describe my hodgepodge career and give it meaning and context and making the whole greater than the sum of the parts gives you a pretty good taste of why he's just been the perfect person to lead New America through a new chapter, because he's able to take disparate pieces of ideas and experiences and perspectives and weave them together into something that is where the whole truly is greater than the sum of the parts. So thank you, Steve. I also just want to thank the New America Foundation. I have been a fellow for quite a long time, but living out in the other Washington in Seattle, I kind of pass through in a semi-regular orbit. And every time I pass through this wonderful space here, I'm more and more thrilled at what New America is doing to shape the discourse and to shape the tone and the tenor of our politics. There are, as all of you who are gathered here today, a remarkable group of fellows and public intellectuals who are housed at New America, but there's also just a world-class team of staff who make things work. Jerry Irvine and Liz Wu from the communications shop really helped put this event together, and I wanted to thank them as well for the efforts that they made in getting us all together tonight. Last of all, I just want to thank all of you for being here tonight. And what I wanted to do was to speak relatively briefly about this new project that Steve has previewed here, and then hopefully open it up to just a wider, looser conversation. My name is Eric Liu, and the book that I'm here to talk about is a new volume that my good friend and co-author Nick Hanauer have just published. We're calling it a pamphlet, and it's a pamphlet in the tradition of Thomas Paine and the pamphleteers of the founding era. And I'll hold it up for you. It's called The True Patriot. And it is, as you see, it's a little red book. And, you know, beware earnest young men of Chinese descent holding little red books. But I think one of the things that we did when we made this little book was quite deliberately to package it this way. What we've done in The True Patriot, what we've tried to do, and I'll speak about this tonight, is lay out an argument about not just the meaning of patriotism and the ways in which that meaning has been, by folks on both left and right, twisted and perverted, but rather to think about what it is, as Steve was saying a moment ago, what are the first principles that ought to undergird our politics, even in the heat of campaign battle today, that ought to be illuminated, that ought to be discussed, and yet have so often fallen by the wayside. And The True Patriot is an attempt to, in a sense, reanimate and reinvigorate our politics with an examination of our first and founding principles. Why patriotism? We came to this project in an interesting way, and you know, I wish we could have claimed the credit for foresight to know that just in the last couple of weeks, patriotism would be such a hot-button issue in the news, where whether or not a particular candidate wears a flag lapel pin, whether or not a candidate's wife expresses sufficient pride in sufficiently appropriate terms in her country, whether another candidate whose incredible service to our country in the military ought to have sole purchase on the idea of patriotism. The word is out there right now, and it is only as the campaign unfolds, I think, going to be more out there, not just because it's a hot issue, but because the debates that we have in this country about patriotism are a powerful proxy for the ways in which our debates are all fundamentally screwed up. And one of the things that I want to talk about this evening is the choice that we made, Nick Hanauer and I, to call this little book The True Patriot. It's not just called The Patriot. It's not just called Patriotism is a Good Thing. It's not just called, you know, our take on patriotism. It's The True Patriot. And we're quite unabashed about doing that. And, you know, it's not just a marketing ploy to have this be a bright red book that people want to pick up and to call it a true patriot. But our notion here is that in our politics today, as polarized as they are, we don't want to add to that polarization. And yet, here's the thing. If we don't name things as they are, then we will dissipate and descend into a politics of less and less meaning and more diffuse purpose. And there are approaches to patriotism that are truly in keeping with the spirit of the founding generation, and there are not. And the ability and the willingness to make those distinctions is something that motivated Nick and I. My goal this evening here is, in talking about the True Patriot and this little project, is in part to talk about the way in which that term and that idea over the course of the last generation and a half has been co-opted, one might say even hijacked, by the far right in this country, but also with equal culpability surrendered by the far left, leaving lots of folks in the political middle in this country unsure of what to do with this phrase and this idea that has just simply become more and more cliche and more just of this embodiment of simple chest thumping or flag waving or unthinking jingoism. And my aim in this evening is to frame up some things so that in our conversation we hopefully can reverse some of those, begin to reverse some of those trends, to reclaim patriotism from those who have unfairly seized it, to remind those who have unwittingly let it go that they ought to own it again, and to try to figure out ways in which everybody, no matter where they're coming from on the political spectrum, can, with integrity, talk again about the true meaning of patriotism. What we're aiming to do, as Steve said, is not simply to put out a book. We do have a book, and we're trying to sell the book, yes. But it's actually much more significant what we're aiming to do. What we're aiming to do is simply and complexly to start massively simultaneous national conversations about the meaning of patriotism in settings like this, through our friends in the media and at C-SPAN, but also in every local church, in every local library, in public schools, at breakfast and dinner tables, to have conversations happening everywhere where people begin to peel away layer upon accreted layer of cynicism and cliche and begin to re-examine what does patriotism mean and what does it call upon us to do. If you think about how it is that we got here, over these 4 decades, as I say, and this goes back at least to the Vietnam era, the way that the word and the idea of patriotism has become increasingly the province of one part of our political spectrum is rather remarkable. And as somebody who comes from the progressive side, and as Steve mentioned, I've worked for a Democratic president, I am a Democrat, it's been incredibly frustrating to me to see that happen. And this book is the product of frustration with the course of our politics and the ways in which this idea of patriotism has been hijacked. And one of the things that Nick and I tried to do in writing The True Patriot is simply this: to remind ourselves that when we talk about patriotism, when we talk about love of country, that what's important is first to frame it in the context of some overarching worldview of moral values and principles. One of the things that is so troubling about our politics today, and we see it every day in the presidential election, but also in local elections, in politics, wherever you find it, is that we have political leaders today who believe, just by temperament and habit now, that all they need to do is talk to us about their policy positions, about issue positions, issue stances, and to draw contrast with someone else's issue positions. And implied in there is this notion that if they do that enough, that most people will be able to or willing to reverse engineer from that set of issue positions an actual framework of moral beliefs and values, and be able to figure out where you as a political leader actually stand and where your values come from. Well, I just don't think most people want to or choose to or are willing to engage in that kind of reverse engineering. And part of our belief in writing this little pamphlet is that in order for us to have a renewed and reinvigorated conversation about politics in this country, we have to begin with principle. We have to begin with the language of moral values and then build our way up to the policies that instantiate them. I was telling Steve at lunch earlier today that I've been geeking out lately and reading and rereading the Federalist Papers, but also the Anti-Federalist Papers, the Constitutional Convention debates. And I'll tell you what, when you read documents like that, you cannot help but get completely charged up again and re-excited about not only the stakes that were at play during that time, but again, these questions of first principle. That wasn't simply a high-toned, high-minded era. The partisanship of politics then makes what we do now look like kid stuff. But even in the midst of that kind of bitter partisanship during the founding era, that era of pamphleteering and where that all began, there was still a generation of leaders who was able and willing to engage deeply on first principle. And we believe that this isn't just something that's good for the country. It actually, when it comes down to, as an electoral strategy, how you win the hearts and the minds of a majority of voters in this country, most people want to be spoken to, and most people reason from here, from the solar plexus more than from the brain. And there is no question that our politics right now, and particularly on the Democratic side, folks have been thinking that if you just issue enough detailed proposals that appeal to the left brain, you will somehow convince people that you're right and that people ought to support you. Well, in laying out this notion of principle and a framework of moral values, one of the things that Nick and I came to wrestle with was the way in which our politics today is so absolutely dominated, one might even say stifled, by a particular narrow, negative conception of freedom. Now, freedom, of course, is a Central American idea, but the notion of freedom that has such a strong hold on our politics today is a different kind of freedom. It's a freedom from. It's a freedom from taxation, a freedom from regulation, a freedom from responsibility to others, a freedom from a sense of greater obligation. And this pervasive, narrow sense of freedom so dominates our political culture that people of both parties feel the need to pay homage to it, to speak to it in some ways. And one of the things that is, I suppose, a measure of progress is that over the course of the last half decade, Democrats have begun to learn that they need a new set of words, and they need to play a different set of word games in order to not simply fall into this particular narrow frame of freedom. But what our belief is in writing The True Patriot is that word games are not enough, and that if you look at the dynamics of American politics and the history of American ideas, there is only one thing that enables you, when you're speaking in terms of moral principle, to trump that narrow negative conception of freedom. And that one thing is an appeal to patriotism. An appeal not only to pride, but to earned pride. An appeal to something greater than yourself, to a purpose and a call that is not simply about the negative freedom from responsibility. And let me just say for a moment why I think that is. If you take the simple idea of patriotism to mean just country above self, and unpack that idea, country above self, well, you end up with a set of moral principles like stewardship rather than exploitation, contribution over consumption, shared sacrifice, mutual obligation, a fair shot for all. Contribution, this idea of country before self leads you inevitably to a set of principles that are irreducibly progressive. They don't belong necessarily to one party or the other, but they are principles that are not just progressive in the sense of 2008 politics, but progressive in the sense that every major faith tradition in the history of the world is, at its core, progressive. Because every major spiritual tradition in the history of the world has a moral hierarchy. And at the top of that moral hierarchy are those for whom it's not about you, are those who are willing to put someone else ahead of themselves. And the idea of putting others before self is what defines who is most moral. I don't care what your tradition is, whether it's Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Islam. And that notion of unpacking the idea of country above self to get to these kinds of values is something that we, in trying to frame up the True Patriot, felt like it was absolutely necessary to do. When you put forward a framework like that of these values, well, it leads you then, yes, to a set of policy prescriptions. The idea of sharing sacrifice leads you inevitably to ask, is it patriotic? Is it truly patriotic to seek elimination of the estate tax? If we take seriously the idea that our responsibility is not only to accumulate for ourselves, but to think about the next generation, if we take seriously the idea that there is no such thing in American life as a self-made man, but that every man or every woman's fortune was built not only by that individual's hard work and persistence and virtue, but on the backs of great schools, clean air, clean water, roads that work, schools that work, colleges that work. In other words, built upon the backs of that which we collectively joined in to say, we will hold one another up. That notion of, in that case, mutual obligation, stewardship, sharing of sacrifice, is something that is, in a way, completely foreign to the way that people talk in politics today. And yet, it's not completely foreign to the way most Americans live their lives. Go to any church service in any part of the country on any given Sunday. Go to any Bible study group. Go to any talking circle or book club in any library. Go to any parent-teacher organization. Go to any space where there are mentors gathering, trying to figure out how they mentor young people. Go to any one of these little platoons, as Tocqueville described them, of our civil society and our democracy, and you will find that though they may not use the same high-toned words and the highfalutin language that I'm using right now, they are talking exactly about these moral principles, and they are talking about a moral framework that is built in these terms, and that these values add up to a notion not only of goodness and not only of the golden rule, but of patriotism. Now, let me speak about patriotism in the other direction, because I've so far been setting it in the contrast against this particular narrow negative notion that those in the far right, I think, have liked to propagate. But at the same time, there are folks, plenty of friends of mine on the left, who are equally culpable of letting our debates about patriotism become as silly and trivial as we've seen them be in the political campaign, in the presidential campaign the last couple of weeks. And one of the problems and challenges here is that on a fundamental level, there are so many progressives in this country and Democrats whose notion of patriotism extends only up to the point where they want to celebrate their right to dissent, protest, complain, and point out what is wrong. Now, believe me, that is an absolutely central and vital aspect of true patriotism. That is an absolutely vital responsibility that everybody holds, left, right, or center. But at the same time, progressives need to remember and be reminded that not only for the merely tactical purposes of earning the trust of a majority of the voters, but simply to be able, with purpose and grounding, to say simply and coherently what they believe and why, progressives have to be able to speak an affirmative language of patriotism that embraces the fact that America is exceptional, and that to announce and to embrace American exceptionalism is not to ratify neocon adventures in Iraq and blind running roughshod adventures in foreign policy. That to embrace American exceptionalism is simply to embrace a simple fact, which is that no other country on earth is dedicated to a proposition. No other country on earth has a set of founding ideals to which it holds itself regularly and against which it holds itself to account. That is not to say by any means, and this is what I think Michelle Obama was alluding to when she made her quite publicized remarks. It is not to say at all that the history of America is a history of continually meeting those ideals. We as a people have failed time and again in ways small and cataclysmic to live up to the promises and the ideals of equal opportunity, a fair shot, and freedom. But the fact that we hold ourselves to account for that, and that we are ever striving to close that gap between ideals and the realities of our institution, that is the measure of our exceptionalism. And that, for that matter, is the very heart of progressivism. It is progress to close that gap. It is progress to seek to close that gap. And progressives need, without hesitation, to be able to, again, embrace that exceptionalism for all that it is. I think one of the things that progressives, particularly since 9/11, have gotten leery, one of the reasons why they've gotten leery of patriotism, are all the ways, shameless and abusive, that this administration has seized the mantle and the word of patriotism to say, you're with us, you're against us, to use it as a club, as a sword, or as a shield to justify all manner of acts of questionable policymaking, lawmaking, or war-making, for that matter. But simply because that is the case, and simply because that is the way our politics has gone these last number of years, does not absolve progressives from the responsibility to continually and passionately express a love of country that is rooted in these ideals. And indeed to say and to claim that true patriotism is at its core progressive. One of the things that when Nick and I have been speaking to a variety of audiences about the True Patriot, that we've come to see is that Americans, most Americans in settings outside the Washington, D.C. Beltway, don't really want to hear about the details of a policy proposal. They don't want to hear about the ways in which Obama's health care plan is better or worse than Clinton's health care plan. It's not that they can't process that information. They can. But they want to get to what are the underlying, again, principles that guide the choices that our political leaders make. And so what we've tried to do in the True Patriot is simply this. It's to lay out a framework that says that in our politics today, if we're going to have honest conversations, that those on the left, we must issue a challenge to those on the left to re-embrace love of country and to change the way in which this overarching frame has unfolded that says if you're a Democrat, you are suspect. If you're a Democrat, you have to literally wear a badge to prove your love of country. But at the same time, to challenge those on the right to remember that the ways in which patriotism have been abused and twisted are not consistent with anyone's principled notion of what conservatism means. And that people like David Brooks, the columnist for the New York Times, who's written eloquently and passionately about what he calls national greatness conservatism, are onto something, that it is possible both to be a conservative and to believe that there is a greater national purpose that we are called to, and to believe that there is a role for positive government. And that to say so is not simply to say, therefore I want a welfare state and a great society unchecked, but that there is a space in that wise middle that a place like New America is trying to carve out as well, where people can come to an understanding of where ideas and principle and policy intersect with common sense. That is the aim of the True Patriot. Our goal here is to catalyze conversations about not only these first principles and what underlies all of our choices and the ways that we talk about politics, but to begin in circle after circle, again, at our workplaces, at the breakfast table, at the dinner table with our children, wherever it may be, with our friends and colleagues, with our pastors, with our teachers, to begin simple conversations about what we believe and why, and to ask ourselves and then to ask our leaders, how are those beliefs patriotic? And what do we mean by that? And how, together, by having those conversations, can we change the very meaning of what patriotism is? So with that, I just want to thank you again, and happy now to begin some conversation and some dialogue. Happy to entertain your questions. Yes, and take the microphone there.
Thanks. This is really refreshing. I went to a book presentation yesterday at the Migration Policy Institute by a progressive, a professor, called Beyond Citizenship, American Identity After Globalization. And he argues that there is no meaning to citizenship anymore, that the whole idea of citizenship is disappearing in the world, and that it really is a bad thing, that citizenship should give way to this kind of global identity where you move where it's best for you economically, and that you will relate to other kinds of groups like churches and all that. So I wonder if you could talk about patriotism also in the sense of citizenship.
Thank you. That's a great question. And I want to make two comments in response to it. You know, first, there is this idea that is out there, particularly among intellectual circles, and especially probably among liberal intellectuals, that says that citizenship, the nation state, have become obsolete, and that patriotism itself is, you know, at best a quirky little anachronism, and at worst a lethal, poisonous thing that must be eradicated. And I just could not disagree with that more. I recognize, of course, we cannot help but recognize that in an era of globalization, of global technologies, of global transnational threats and opportunities, that national borders may not mean as much as they once did. But there still can be no question that in 2008, and I would submit to you in 2058, this will remain the case, that nation states remain, for better and for worse, the agents of change and action in the world, but also the guarantors in those nations that do guarantee it, the guarantors of what freedoms we may hold dear. There is no transnational agency. There is no transnational entity that will guarantee our freedoms. There is no transnational entity that will hold the United States to account, or to whom the United States ought rightly listen to in being held to account for whether it lives up to its ideals. Yes, we do need in our times, and certainly the younger generation right now that's growing up with a technology-assisted, much more globally minded worldview and sense of things, is going to push the boundaries of things. But I would say to you that it is perhaps no more urgent than in our times right now to recognize that the nation still matters, not just practically, not just institutionally, but morally. Now, the second thing I want to say, though, in response to your question, because, you know, it's not just about the nation state in some abstract sense, but it's about, you know, in these times, does patriotism have a place? You know, we call this a pamphlet. We made this little book as, you know, as you'll see, we interspersed our own writings and arguments with a playlist, so to speak, of greatest hits of American texts and speeches from the founding generation, from Washington, from Lincoln, from TR, FDR, RFK, JFK, Jane Addams, MLK. And our notion there was quite simple. We say it in the introduction to the book. There's not a single new idea in the True Patriot. All we have tried to do is to cull and gather and synthesize what are the animating deep principles, what is the operating moral DNA of this country. And so when we're asked, does patriotism seem anachronistic in our times, in these modern times where kids hardly even think or talk in these terms, we say, no, no, no. It's time quite deliberately to go retro. And so we printed this as a pamphlet, and we printed it in the same typeface that Thomas Paine and Ben Franklin and the writers of the Declaration did, to remind us that, they had something back in that generation. They had a seriousness not only of ideas and a willingness to engage in principle, but what they had was a notion of purpose. The opening of the True Patriot is called A Politics of Purpose. And that, to me, is the reason why patriotism matters. Purpose is a word that, you and our viewers can hear many different ways. But however you want to express it, it matters. When Rick Warren, the pastor at the Saddleback Church in Orange County, California, runs his mega church, he's the author of this massively best-selling book called The Purpose-Driven Life. Many of you probably have encountered. What's the first line of The Purpose-Driven Life? Does anybody here know? The first line of The Purpose-Driven Life, which is a book based in Scripture on how people who are searching for meaning and purpose in their lives can come over the course of 40 days to find it. The very first line of that book is, "It's not about you." It's not about you. And I would say that same yearning for purpose, for a sense of connection to something that is larger than ourselves, to be woven into a storyline that is greater than our own, is also what is fueling a lot of what's exciting about our politics right now. Whatever may happen with Barack Obama and his candidacy, there's no question that he has tapped into a similar yearning for purpose, for meaning and for calling that is being expressed in civil religious terms and not purely religious terms, but it is the same human yearning that starts right here. And that yearning, at its best, when captured, when phrased, and when reflected back to the people of this country, is expressed and embodied in the kind of progressive patriotism that I've tried to enumerate and elaborate upon tonight. At its worst, that yearning for purpose and for belonging can be twisted in ways that can give patriotism a bad name. And I think that's the thing. There is nothing inherently good or bad, true or false about the notion of patriotism, except what we invest in it, except what meaning we put into it, and except what either passivity or activity we bring to our engagement with one another in public life and in civic life. So I just wanted to say that the idea of patriotism, wholly apart from the question of borders eroding, it matters, and it matters because we are human beings who seek purpose, and because this country, unique in the world, has a notion of purpose that is universal in its aspiration for progress and for the betterment of individuals, but also for the achievement of a fair shot. Yes, sir.
Eric, I wish you well. I must say I'm a little skeptical about the picture you paint of the country, and it would be nice if it was the way you describe it, or could be. But the picture I have from what you've said is of a social democracy. That's what I'm hearing. And this isn't a social democracy. Canada is, Western Europe, etc. It's a very different place. You talked about Christianity, for example, in this country. I'm an Episcopalian. It's a minority church, quite unrepresentative. In fact, sometimes Christianity in this country, the mainstream churches, like the Southern Baptists, it's not what you are together, it's what sets you apart from others. So I really wonder about, the inclusion of faith. I think that's very questionable. You also talked about the little platoon remark. It may be de Tocqueville, but I thought it was Edmund Burke, in fact, who talked about the little platoon. And it seems to me America, by its nature, is many, many platoons, but it's not one general platoon. And so, for example, one of the issues that sets America apart, from the OECD nations is a national health system. I don't think you'll ever have one. So what I'm saying is, where's the commonality here that you're talking about? It would be nice if I could see it, but I don't see it.
It's a great set of questions, and I will let me try to speak to several of your points. In the first place, about social democracy, I want to be clear about one thing. In enumerating the values, the virtues, the principles of what we believe true patriotism is all about, we are talking about the ways in which people engage one another and the ways that we hold our leadership in politics to account. Now, you're right that to hear words like mutual obligation, stewardship, shared sacrifice, is to arrive at a place that is not every man for himself. That is not let the market sort things out. That is not laissez-faire unchecked. That is true. But simply to be distinguishing yourself from that kind of market fundamentalism does not throw you all the way over to socialism. And one of the things that Nick and I are going to be doing in a subsequent volume, actually, the next in this series of pamphlets, is to be writing more specifically about a theory of government that I think goes in part to what you're saying. But what we've said in the True Patriot is this: there is a place for the market. For instance, we talk in one of the heart of this book, The True Patriot, is what we call a 10-principle plan. And that is in response in good measure to the way in which politicians left and right have their 10-point plans, their 10 issue position plans. But rarely can they actually tell you what the animating principles are that actually undergird their issue position platform. And as we laid out our 10-principle plan, one of the principles in there was this notion of patriotic capitalism. Okay? And let me say a word about what we mean by that. Nick Hanauer, I should say, my co-author, is a highly successful entrepreneur, technology investor in Seattle. His last company, a company he founded called Quantive, was sold to Microsoft for in the neighborhood of $6.4 billion. He is no enemy of free enterprise. He is no enemy of the marketplace. And he is no blind follower in the idea that the government ought to dictate anything. However, it is precisely because of Nick's experience in that realm that he, if he were here today, I'm going to channel him, he would say to us that capitalism exists not in some God-given way. Markets are man-made constructs. And as man-made constructs, they benefit some and not others. And what patriotic capitalism means is having the courage from time to time to examine those constructs, to examine those rules, to check those guardrails, and make sure the markets we've made are in fact working for the most people that they can work for. And that is a recognition that you have to have a balance. You have to have a balance. And if you take the idea of the market as something that's completely unchecked and unfettered, the way that so much of our political rhetoric runs, that is just simply not where we live as a country, but it's also simply not where most Americans want to be. In this day and age, I mean, the old line that we're all Keynesians now, I mean, in this day and age when the Bush administration is the author of Medicare Part D, we're all Great Society liberals today. We have inherited an edifice of social programs and a role of government that the left and the right argue about on the margins but are not fundamentally changing. And one of the things that has to happen in this next generation of politics is to do what New America Foundation is doing and ask ourselves, what are the terms, the dimensions, and the reach of a new social contract? And in doing that, we're going to have to ask, what are the new ways that government has to respond? What are the new ways that government can not so much be in the distributive role, but in a catalytic role to allow markets and allow social trends to unfurl and unfold in ways that benefit the people? These are new ways of thinking that can't be put in the boxes of either, laissez-faire run amok or socialism or even social democracy. Now, the second thing that I want to say to your point about faith and the role of faith, I want to kind of expand it to a larger point, because I think embedded in your question is this notion of, gosh, Eric, isn't it naive to speak of this kind of unifying set of national values and principles when we are so riven by all of these little lines and fault lines of identity and identity politics. Some are along the lines of faith, some are about race, some are about other aspects of our identity. And isn't that naive? And I guess I'll say in part, yeah. It is naive only in the sense that our founders were naive when they thought that it would be possible out of the Big Bang of the Revolution and the semi-failed experiment of the Confederation to actually create a union that would last. That was rather naive. It's naive in the same sense that Abraham Lincoln was naive when he thought that the Union could hold in spite of all evidence to the contrary. It was naive in the way that Teddy Roosevelt was absolutely naive in the way that he went to fight against the monopolistic concentrations of wealth that were skewing not just the economy, but the social fabric in our country's life. It was naive in the way that Ronald Reagan said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Naivete goes a long way in politics when it is grounded in principle. And what I would say about this notion of identity politics, whether it's along the lines of faith, race, or other things, is that this is all the more reason why patriotism matters in America. When I said earlier that no other country on earth is founded on a proposition or dedicated to a proposition, there's a good side and a bad side to that, right? The good side is we have these universal ideals carved into our Declaration, carved into our Constitution, carved into the jurisprudence that has flowed from both of those, and that we're always trying to live up to those. But the bad side of that is that we don't have a whole lot else holding us together. This is not a nation of blood. This is not a nation of a single religion. This is not a nation in which a single tribal experience has bonded us all together and gives us shared identity. This is a nation in which, save the magnetic power of these ideals, we are always flying apart centrifugally. And so it becomes all the more important in the American context to articulate a patriotism that can be that magnet, that can hold us together. And that's not just because we have a United States and we want to keep having a United States. It's not just to kind of perpetuate some status quo that we inherited. It is to recognize, again, the specialness of this experiment. My mother's in the room tonight, and I sense from your voice, sir, that, like her, you were not born in the United States. Probably many of the people in this room can go back at most 1-2 generations to find somebody who was not born in the United States. Why did we or our forebears choose to make this place home? Why did those of us who were forcibly brought to this place choose still to make it home and to try to bring this place in line with its ideals? Why? Because of that notion of promise and purpose that I spoke of. It's not simply the idea that America is the greatest free trade zone the world has ever seen and there's more material opportunity here than everywhere else. There's something else that draws people here, that holds us here, and that ought to hold us together. And I would say to you that it's precisely in an era where identity politics is becoming more and more prevalent, where technology or the internet allows us to flock with birds of finer and finer feathers and to separate ourselves into smaller and smaller tribes, that we need to renew our ability to speak a transcendent language of American patriotism. Yes, you in the back.
Bunch of comments, but one is I agree with what you're saying that patriotism matters, but I think the thing is you can't prescribe really what that'll be. I mean, patriotism, kind of like love, it happens. It's not something that can be prescribed, and I think in a way common experiences like 9/11, that common experiences are what bring a nation together and help to foster that. But back to what this gentleman was saying about the platoons, and I kind of agree with him. You said at one point, you mentioned churches and synagogues and religious institutions, PTA meetings, Boy Scouts, and how they all have, instruct moral codes, and that these morals equal good. And you went from those generalities, moral codes, good equals patriotism, and I think that's kind of naive, because clearly, a Boy Scout troop that specifically dictates against, gay members in one town versus another that has another objective. I mean, you can't make such generalizations. And I want to say, when you mentioned healthcare, nobody wants to talk about that. I think a lot of people really do want to hear talk about that, and more than hear their principles or what defines their idea of patriotism. People do want to hear things like that. And I just think that it's just not something that you can dictate. And back, just one more thing I want to say is, when you talk about patriotism and this general ideal, I think, and progressives, I think that the way I see it, I missed the beginning of your talk, but I think in terms of it being hijacked, it's been more people criticizing the administration more than the country, and it's not a lack of patriotism, but a lack of maybe support of the current administration. Thanks.
Wonderful comments, and again, you know, several things I want to respond to. I kind of want to take them in reverse order, actually. The last point you made about the hijacking of patriotism and the way that it's kind of acquired a partisan twist. One of the things that is so striking to me is the way in which, look, the media, whether you're talking traditional media, new media, national media, local media, collectively create a story, reflect back a story to us. And there are dominant stories in national life. And the dominant story in our time right now is a story that says Republicans should be assumed to love their country, Democrats, not so sure. It is because that is the frame that a story like the lapel pin thing with Barack Obama or Michelle Obama's comments gets the traction that it gets, because it feeds into this pre-baked idea that Democrats, at least since the Vietnam era, have been more interested in distancing themselves from this country than in embracing it. And I'm not speaking to the truth of that frame. I actually think that frame is completely untrue. But I am saying it is a frame that determines so much of the way that politics unfolds today, and that if we want to have an honest conversation about anything, healthcare not least, we have to first name, acknowledge, and break that frame. Because otherwise, what we'll have is what we had in 2004. John Kerry had no shortage of great ideas on healthcare. He had a really good healthcare plan. He had a really good education plan. He had a really, you know, and you could agree with them or disagree with his plans. You could quibble with this. You could say it was going to be a bad thing for the country or a good thing. But the fact is, nobody heard it. Because what he got stuck in was the vortex of this notion that Democrats can't really be trusted to love their country. And that Republicans, especially Republicans who speak from the gut, do. And I think that, you know, that it is frustration with that frame that impelled Nick Hanauer and me to write The True Patriot. Now, your earlier point about patriotism can't be dictated, I would agree with 1,000%. And I can't help that I come to this topic with enthusiasm and passion, but please don't mistake my passion or enthusiasm or my comments earlier about the Little Red Book and all that to mean that I want to dictate to anybody what they ought to do or think. What Nick and I did when we wrote The True Patriot, we didn't set out to write a book about patriotism. We were frustrated. And we were frustrated with the caliber of our political leadership and with the fact that so many political leaders could not articulate what they believe and why on the level of principle. And then we realized, we held up a little mirror to ourselves and realized, oh geez, we can't do that either. And so we began to try to sit down and articulate for ourselves, if nobody else, how we came to our framework of moral values and beliefs, how we see the world. Steve, in his introduction, mentioned a previous book of mine called Guiding Lights, which is about great mentors and teachers. And the work of that book has shaped me profoundly in thinking about the ways in which, completely outside the realm of government, Americans form and shape one another in their values, in relationships of mentorship, formal and informal. And that Americans don't need to be told twice the ways in which we are woven into this web of relationship and obligation, right? And it was in reflecting upon that Nick and I, experiences like that Nick and I laid out what our values were. And as we did that, we began to realize that, hey, there's something here that perhaps others would like to respond to. And so our attitude about The True Patriot is, this is our best shot at a notion of what we think patriotism truly ought to mean, if we want to dust off all the cliche, if we want to scrape away all the partisanship, this is our best shot. And we so invite you, anybody in this room, any reader, anybody who comes across our work, to do us one better. Or to say, I'm not even going to try to do you one better. I just have a completely alternative, different view or take on things. And mine ought to sit right next to yours. And that's great. For us, success is not the wholesale universal adoption of the program of this little red book. For us, success is conversations and debates like this happening all over the country where people are just going back to first principle and arguing about them. If in the end everybody in this country, you take a poll, comes to say that, you know what, this thing's a crock. If they've come to that conclusion after deeply considered, forcefully engaged, passionate, moral and intellectual engagement with one another as citizens, then we will have considered our venture an absolutely smashing success. So it's not about trying to dictate, it is just trying to catalyze. And the last thing I just want to say to this is back to sort of to the platoons point. One of the things that I think, one of the hallmarks of our time, you know, if you take the long view of things and think about the ways in which the agrarian era shaped American politics, and then the industrial era gave us a different kind of politics, literally, machine politics, right? And you take the long view and think, you know, we're just at the early phase of a network era. And we don't fully yet know how that's going to change and shape our politics, but we do know this much, that the injection of a single meme, an idea virus like True Patriotism, into the kind of networks that we have today is going to enable a kind of engagement of everyday Americans, conversation and online, offline debates and discussions to an order of magnitude and to an extent that would not have been possible 15, 20 years ago. 15, 20 years ago, this really would have been some guy at a podium holding forth, trying to broadcast his views and impose them to the world. Now, I do have this podium, and I've put out some ideas, but in circles like this, in the blogosphere, online, everywhere you go, people are going to take this, tear it apart, rebuild it, re-engineer it, do what they will with it. And that's a beautiful thing and a mark of our networked era. And so one of the things that's exciting to us about True Patriotism is the way that it is adaptable fundamentally to the changes in the ways that our society itself adapts and evolves. Yes, ma'am.
I thought my question for you was going to be tough. Now I realize I might be the easy one. The last book talk I went to was Dana Milbank's Homo Politicus, and so I'm very refreshed to be here. I'm so glad you called this to my attention. So I'm going to get back to Homo Politicus because it is a tough question that I'll ask at the end. Homo Politicus is important. I mean, I think it's important that Dana laid out what's going on in Washington, how it is. It's not his responsibility to question it or change it or offer an alternative point of view. And so it's important that it's out there, but it was not inspiring. You talked about freedom from, and I wanted to hear more about freedom to. And I feel like, certainly with our generation, that we take that for granted, on the one hand, and then looking at our government, wonder, can we make a difference with all the major pieces of influence out there? How can we make a difference? Lately, I would say I felt that there's a moral obligation to actually do something that I can't take freedom to for granted. I see it eroding, and so I've made some choices about standing up for freedom to, which is very idealistic, and I'll stand there with you to do that. We are based on rugged individualism, and that's how we talk in this country. And yet I don't know of a story of one person who has made it because he or she as an individual has done something. It's always with help from others. And so as I work in international development, and every single day I'm reminded that I am where I am today because of where I was born, because of what this country offers me, and because of how I've been helped out in my life, the opportunities I've been given. And so I think that's the sort of thing that we can no longer take for granted. So the tough question, Dana was talking about Homo Politicus, and I'm sure you're familiar with Homo Politicus. And And I asked, if you want to make it, or I asked him to give me some examples of people who've made it in D.C., in the system, without playing by the rules. And how did they do it? And he said, his answer was short. He said, they don't make it. They're here for 2 years and they leave. I can relate to that. You've been in the White House, so you know what the system looks like. I believe in grassroots movements, and yet I fear that grassroots movements can't necessarily influence the way our country is run. And so I want to know from you what you think about how we take this grassroots movement and actually change the way decisions are made in Washington.
Thank you, Carlisle, for that question. The book that she's referring to is by my good friend, who I will take, I feel, complete license to make fun of now, Dana Milbank, a book called Homo Politicus. Dana is, as many of you know, a columnist for the Washington Post, and the book is a tongue-in-cheek anthropologist's take on the strange species that inhabit this weird ecosystem called the Beltway, and the strange rituals and rules that guide life in that ecosystem. Dana does what Dana's supposed to do, which is to, as an astute, sharp-eyed, clear-eyed observer of things, report them back to us and with enough pointedness and wryness that we perhaps not only recognize ourselves, but are a little bit shamed into trying to improve who we are, those of us who care about politics. But your larger point is about, I mean, there are two larger points. One is about how to sustain idealism in the operation of power. That's what I take to be one question. And then the second question is this one about how to make change, from the grassroots when so much power is, in the end, concentrated in more formal levers of social change in government. Let me speak to the first one first. Power and idealism. I'm disappointed that Dana didn't point to me when he asked about people who kind of maintain their idealism here. But on the other hand, he wouldn't point to me because I left. I went to the other Washington. I live in Seattle now. And I did that for a lot of reasons. There was a push and a pull. The pull of Seattle is that it is one of the planet's most exciting entrepreneurial communities to be found. I don't mean just kind of in a business sense. I just mean in a civic sense, in a spirit of openness and possibility and things yet to be authored. But the push part, why I felt it was possible in time to leave here, was the cynicism that Dana both reports on and in some ways reinforces in a book like Homo Politicus. And I recognize that there is a, if not a zero-sum game, there is a real trade-off between becoming more and more masterful in the arts of wielding power in Washington, D.C., on the one hand, and on the other, maintaining a sense, the sense of naivete and possibility and imagination that I was speaking about earlier. I don't think they are mutually exclusive, but they are in tension. And you're right to point out that rare are the leaders who can hold both. But I would say to you that we are at one of those pivot points in American history where that is precisely the kind of leader we need to have, not only in the White House, but it's the kind of leader we need to have in City Hall. It's the kind of leader we need to have in the state legislature. It's the kind of leader we need to have running the state political party, whether you're Democrat or Republican. That these are the kinds of people we need to encourage. You know, in political leadership, when it comes to this question of idealism, there's a supply problem, there's a demand problem, right? And you can say, yeah, the supply of these kinds of leaders, where are the TRs of our age, the RFKs of our age, the FDRs of our age? You can bemoan the fact that the supply seems painfully short. But there's a demand side to this too. I mean, there is a certain market dynamic in American democracy. And until and unless enough of us gather up enough of us to get enough of a voice and enough critical mass to demand a different kind of leader, to reward a different kind of leader at the ballot box, to stick with that different kind of leader even when they do something wrong or even when they make a choice that we might not personally agree with in that moment. The more we do that to stimulate demand in this country, the more that supply will increase. You know, I mean, I've been around politicians enough to tell you, and I mean this not as a slam, it's actually in praise of democracy. Most political leaders are followers. They are outstanding, tactically sharp followers with highly attuned senses for which way to move. That's not a slam. I mean, that is an art. But there comes a time where if we want a different kind of leader, we're going to have to generate the demand. And that segues, I guess, to your second question about grassroots versus simply kind of trying to get into the halls of power. It's a both and. You know, what you're doing in international development is work that makes plain to a lot of people at home and abroad in a very tangible way, literally in a food in your mouth kind of way or a books on your school desk kind of way, the simple fact of our time, which is massive, irresistible, irreversible interdependence. Right? And so when you do that kind of work, you model for everybody around you, not just in the countries that you may be doing development work in, but for your fellow citizens here, that interdependence is the watchword of our time. And that awareness of interdependence matters, right? And that has to happen. That's part of the whole formula. As that's happening, there have to be people who are willing and able to speak the language that, for instance, Barack Obama has been speaking, but also who are able to speak a language of patriotic virtue that John McCain has spoken in the past. I don't know how many of you have read Faith of Our Fathers, one of John McCain's memoirs. It's a story in great measure of his time in the POW camp. And there are just some absolutely inspiring and riveting passages in there where he describes how, in the midst of being in that POW camp, his notion of patriotism descended, or kind of, his notion of patriotism moved from mere cliche or reflex to something deeply thought through and deeply considered. And what he began to realize that it was not simply freedom by itself, but that it was a freedom worth having that made him love his country so much. And that a freedom worth having requires an ethic of service. And that is a part that I hope whoever the Democratic nominee ends up being is able not only to praise John McCain for having that ethic of service, but is willing to join hands with John McCain and say, everybody in this country needs to embody and pursue and propagate that ethic of service. You know, so it is simultaneously about the work that we do in our lives at the grassroots and the kinds of leaders that we seek out and reward and create demand for. There is no either or. And, you know, in a way, this gets to the points that were being made earlier. There is no single prescription for how to make this kind of change. In a sense, I mean, not to get too grandiose about it, but what Nick Hanauer and I are trying to do when we put this little pamphlet out there, True Patriot, is to catalyze a movement. And it's not a movement dedicated toward, it's not a movement whose success will be defined by the passage of a particular piece of legislation. It is a movement, and again, I hesitate to say this because I don't want to sound grandiose, and yet it speaks to our desires and our goals here. It is a movement, it is the civic equivalent of the kinds of great awakenings that we've had in religious and spiritual life during this country's history. I want there to be a civic great awakening. And that's not going to happen just because Eric Liu and Nick Hanauer wrote a cool book and because we spoke at New America and C-SPAN covered it. That's going to happen, yes, because that happened and a million other things like that happened, some of which are super well known and will get blasted to everybody through the media, some of which will be known only to a small circle of people where they live and build their lives. And because all of that is going to be happening simultaneously, we will and can tip the culture toward that kind of civic great awakening. That is our goal. And although we are deeply engrossed in the ebb and the flow and the dynamics of the horse race and the 2008 election, this is just a blip. We're taking the long view of this. It's going to take 5, 10, 15 years to lay the kind of moral, intellectual framework and groundwork for this kind of awakening. Yes, Lee.
Thanks for being here again, Eric. Just a comment, and it's that you're talking about patriotism, you're talking about America's an exceptional country in traditional terms that we all know about. We're getting challenged to think about that very hard on an international scale because of China, Russia, among others. But, you know, Medvedev has just been elected. The story we hear from the Russian press, TASS and so on, is that, you know, whatever's happened to get that election to happen has to be excused because Russia is exceptional in its own way. In China, when we have lead problems in toys, we have problems with heparin being not heparin, we have the excuse that British, American, other interests for a century plus have been pillaging and taking advantage of China. So we're really being challenged on an international scale to think of what America really stands for and to really put it into play, because after all, people have to take drugs. They have to get those drugs somewhere. They're going to come from China at some point, or India, as well as other places. And we have to be able to fight that exceptionalism on the other side as well.
Lee, that's a great observation. And I guess I would say this, several things in response. What do Nick and I mean by American exceptionalism? Let me first, because it's helpful to do this, tell you what we don't mean. We don't mean American triumphalism. We don't mean a chest thumping my way or the highway. We don't mean running roughshod over allies and making allies less happy allies and adversaries more willing adversaries. We don't mean that at all. I actually think, as you'll see when you get a chance to read The True Patriot, our notion of exceptionalism, because it is grounded in these ideals, and because the ideals are universal, is an invitation for all the world to join us in trying to live up to these ideals, but a recognition of a simple historical fact, which is that it is only this particular polity that has actually been working at that in the way that we've been working at it, and that is open to anybody to come and join the effort to work at closing that gap. So the thing is, I think exceptionalism and humility are not mutually exclusive. You can believe in American exceptionalism, in the uniqueness of our nation's purpose. Our nation's purpose is to show the way, to show how you build a society that has a promise of a fair shot, freedom, and equal opportunity, and try to actually make that work. And we have failed time and again, and we stumble, and we falter again, and each time we get up, and we pick up, and we try again. And that is a way to show other people in other countries. But we do that with humility, because there is, in equal measure, there are things to learn. Our knowledge of the world, not just world languages, but world cultures, our knowledge of the world is pitiful. I mean, for the young generation today, knowledge of the world is almost as bad as just knowledge of the civic text that we excerpt in The True Patriot. And there is no question that, we have to increase the knowledge precisely in order to deepen that wellspring of humility. But I will say that, Nick and I, when we wrote this, and we debated both with ourselves and with many intellectuals, political leaders, and folks who we had as early readers, who gave us a lot of pushback on this idea that American exceptionalism ought to be one of our 10 operating principles. And we stand by it because it is grounded in these kinds of universal ideals. Yes, ma'am. I don't know where the microphone went.
It's okay. I had a question. Did you, in looking at the whole question of patriotism, actually look at the fact the etymology goes back to patria, with patria, which is from Roman sources, and that the one thing that all families satisfied was really this classical education, so that despite the fact they all were Christians, but different denominations, they all shared this understanding of what the ideal republic would be from their upbringing in this classical tradition. And I really very sympathetic to everything you're saying. But I also feel that people in America have forgotten that a lot of our founding principles really are coming from both the Enlightenment and from a Greco-Roman tradition, as well as the Judeo-Christian tradition. And, and I'm Jewish and I teach at Catholic University, so I have nothing against faith. But, come on. The real grounds, the thing that really inspired the Founding Fathers, and it's very clear, is really this sense of virtue that comes out of what citizenship and what patria means is a sense of virtue, and that measuring up to that standard and being measured up by tradition on that basis is such a Roman ideal that really is what I think we should be reasserting as well, and not just simply have it framed in religious terms, because I think it's also in secular terms as well.
Thank you very much for pointing that. And I think as you get a chance to read The True Patriot, you will find that we are both mindful of and pay great homage to those origins, and that our notion of virtue, which is a word that we use quite regularly and forcefully in the pages of The True Patriot, even though it's a word that gives plenty of progressives kind of, the willies, because it sounds like right-wing moralizing, that we are unabashed about articulating a notion of virtue. That's not religious, but it is civic virtue. And when I was describing earlier how I'd been geeking out and reading the Federalist Papers and the Constitutional Convention debates, who authored many of the Federalist Papers? It was not, yes, it was Hamilton, Jay, and Madison, but they signed it Publius. They were mindful of the fact that they were the next link in a chain that went back at least as far as the Roman Republic and the ideas that began there. And one of the things that we have to do right now, in the pages of The True Patriot, we don't cite the Roman Republic, text from the Roman Republic, but we do, as I say, excerpt these words from the founding, from the Gettysburg Address, from little-known speeches by RFK, from things that Teddy Roosevelt had said, that all flow into not just some generic, happy July 4th notion of love your country, but again, to the values and virtues that are required. This is not cost-free patriotism. The patriotism that we are asking for and putting forth here is a patriotism of the sort that John Kennedy spoke of. Ask not. Ask not what your country can do for you, And that idea of ask what you can do for your country itself has become a cliche. That itself has kind of gotten swept up in just our media mess, right? And so that's a phrase that's just out there that you can repeat but not really think about the content of it. But that is something that we're trying to return to in deep, deep earnest here. Yes, sir. Yeah, you.
Thanks. I'm a Chinese student studying at George Mason University. I have two questions. First is about the difference between nationalism and patriotism. Because it seems to me that patriotism is a good word in this country, at least for Republicans. But nationalism seems to be a bad word. And second is about Asian Americans. I just read your book, Accidental American, I think. Central Asian, yeah. But I read the Chinese version. It's translated by published in Taiwan also. Yeah. As you mentioned in the book, that Asian Americans are now they are called as new Jews in these days. And my observation is that on one hand, they are not protected by affirmative action. And on the other hand, they do not enjoy the social status of a rich white. So my question is, can Asian Americans become white like Jews did before? And if yes, when? Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. Nationalism versus patriotism, I think one could have a very Talmudic philosophical discussion about the distinctions between the two. And one can also have just a purely political conversation about why one word carries certain connotations and another carries others. I would just, what I would venture to say, nationalism in a modern American context, I think is associated with a notion of ethnic nationalism and the pride of a particular ethnic group, whether at home or abroad. And in the American context, the kind of patriotism that Nick and I are writing about in The True Patriot is precisely one that is that transcends the ethnic or other affinities that any given citizen or group of citizens might enter political or public life with. That there are universals, that in America there are universals. Now, that does not mean that in America everybody is equally well off and that everybody has equally good life chances and that everybody's equally paid attention to. This goes to your second point. That is fundamentally, in fact, not true. And when I wrote The Accidental Asian, part of my aim there was not simply to write about personal experience of being second-generation Asian American, but to illuminate a perspective on race and identity in this nation that was literally and figuratively neither black nor white. And when you look at something in those terms that is neither black nor white, you begin to see all the ways in which, for much of this nation's history, Americanness was bound inextricably with a certain notion of whiteness, right? And we've all internalized that, right? So that when somebody of my parents' generation, for instance, talks about somebody who is non-white, they say, and someone else who is white, they call the white person American. There is a lot of that kind of that we've internalized, that kind of linking together of whiteness and Americanness. And I wrote The Accidental Asian about a decade ago to offer my best shot at trying to break that linkage. If America is going to deliver on its promise, then Americanness cannot be bound up in that way with whiteness. It will not do to say, oh, well, whiteness is an ever adaptable and flexible concept, right? When the Irish first came here, they weren't considered white, and then after a generation, they got called white. When the Jews first came, they weren't considered white, but then a generation passed and they were called white. So you Asian Americans, wait a while. You'll be considered white too after a bit. That to me is not a bargain I want to sign up for. That would be a rather Pyrrhic victory. In fact, no victory at all. Because simply reinforcing the way in which whiteness equals normalness, even as the concept of who gets to be white, even if somebody with my face no longer is barred from the category of whiteness, that's not okay. I want, the reason why I wrote The Accidental Asian, and certainly one of the reasons why Nick Hanauer and I, wrote The True Patriot. Nick, like me, is the son of immigrants. And our notion, and we live in Washington State. We live in a state where our most recent governor is a Chinese American, Gary Locke. And we wrote this book so that we could hasten the day when people in this room, but also people around the globe, when they say American, they can imagine a whole panoply of colors and kinds of faces, that it's not immediately the word association game conjuring up some white man's face. And that is the very purpose. True patriotism is not wedded to blood. It is not wedded to who has owned this country the longest. It is not wedded to who got here first. It is not wedded to who still controls a disproportionate amount of power, wealth, and opportunity in this country. True patriotism is something that we all own, and that especially those who are less enfranchised, who are on the margins, and who do not have the kind of access that those who have been called white have, that especially those of us in that position have to forcefully say, we own this too. And it's by staking that claim that we change not only the meaning of patriotism, but the course of the country's future. Yes, ma'am. And then I'll get to you.
I have, as an education entrepreneur, I have experienced humility beyond my imagination. And all of my colleagues want to see a defined product. So my question, along with asking you the ideals, I don't know what you were talking about, the ideals, but are you thinking that America showing the way would lead, I mean, what is the definition of showing the way? Is it, in fact, this picture of a leader or leaders, or is it actions and deeds of those leaders that would impact the world's opinion? In other words, I've been higher than a kite with my concept, but now it's the rubber has to hit the road.
Sure.
And I have to prove the tangible success of what I'm doing.
Sure.
So that's why I have a lot of confidence with this question, and I'm very sensitive to what you're saying, and I love good intellectual thought, but where's the beef? What are we going to do in the world, action-wise, to show the world that we are who we are?
So I feel like we're channeling a little bit you, Hillary, me, Obama, and I don't want to.
Well, I don't know. If so, fair is fair. Or does this vision of your leadership not allow the other side to enter in? I don't know.
Here's what I would say. I mean, and it's not particularly in defense of Obama, because I think Obama, that's a whole other conversation about Hillary versus Barack Obama. I want to speak about this point of words / values / ideas, and on the one hand, and the beef on the other. Yeah, but when you ask where's the beef, the beef of action is over here, and then there are mere words and values and principles over here. And I want to I just, from the core, challenge that framing for two reasons. It is not because I discount the importance of the actions. I worked in government. I've worked in democratic administration on a variety of policy issues in order to move the dial in an action-oriented way on issues that people care about, on education, on health care, on child care, you name it, right? But what I came to see, the longer I spent here, was that that kind of action, those kinds of mechanics, detached from some articulated notion of purpose and values, becomes mere plumbing. And I think plumbers matter, but architects do too. And I think one of the things that we have to recognize is that if you want to build a house that works, it's not just to have one or the other. You have to have the architects who can frame up the values, and you have the plumbers who can make stuff work inside.
That's what I learned as an entrepreneur.
And I would say, as an entrepreneur, you can especially appreciate the power of example. When I say show the way, I don't mean show the way in terms of we're going to invade your country and show you the way to do democracy. I mean leadership by example. And to me, I mean, it's just a statement of fact that when the students, half organized as they were, perhaps naive as they were, and ultimately crushed as they were, in Tiananmen Square, organized and rallied and began to do what they did there during that time in 1989, there was an icon they turned to. The icon was not the Eiffel Tower. The icon was not a statue of Lenin. The icon was not some other, object. The icon was the Statue of Liberty. And what was embodied in that icon, the values, the words, the spirit, mattered as much as the fact that America and their knowledge of American history is a history of on the ground, in action, in the civil rights movement, in the progressive movement, in the women's movement, in every movement that has made this country better and fuller for everybody here, has made that symbolism, that patriotic iconography, actually matter. So it is the fusion of the two. But I think leading by example, if we stick to our knitting and make this a country where people do have health care, where people recognize that health care is not just a policy issue, but is a moral obligation, that from a perspective of mutual obligation, we owe it to one another just on a fundamental level. If we take seriously the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that there is no pursuit of happiness when you are hobbled, literally and figuratively, by your inability to purchase health insurance, right? When we engage in issues like that, that fuse together both the practical action and the ideals that animate them, then we are leading by example, and hopefully people in the next Tiananmen squares, wherever they may be in the world, will recognize that we aren't just a country of empty symbolism and made-for-TV flag waving. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I wanted to go or follow up on these points, but also go back to the idea of movement and grassroots movement also, and combine that with the idea that you just spoke about of the need for leaders and thinkers as well as the activists. And I'm wondering if maybe you have seen an article that maybe not coincidentally I read over the weekend by a woman named Sarah Robinson, and I found it on the Campaign for America's Future website. I'm not even sure who she is, but and this article is a part of a series that she's doing on exactly what you're speaking of, and she addresses it in terms of the progressive movement and getting it to consolidate its core ideals and principles, and get them out in a way that catches the imagination again of Americans. This is something that I've also been thinking about for a long time, is strategy, and it's something I wanted to just put out there, especially in relation to how the conservative movement has progressed over the last 30 years in the way that they built a grassroots movement, but they had a strategic vision that came from a few core individuals, and this is what Sarah Robinson's article speaks to, and in fact she seeks to emulate this process. And it occurs to me that the manual is out there of how to move this, or how to put forth this movement, grow this movement upon ideals. It very well may be, but the original, she's saying that the original conservative literature on this is indeed also a manual for pushing forward a progressive movement. But one of the keys is that there are leaders and strategists that keep, as she said, the frogs from jumping out of the wheelbarrow if you're trying to move somewhere.
Well, I just got the sign that this will be our last question, and I will be sticking around and delighted to continue conversations, sign books. I also neglected to mention at the outset our appreciation for our friends at Politics and Prose for being here to sell books and partner with us tonight. The one thing that I would say absolutely is the short answer. The conservative movement, whether one subscribes to their ideological views or not, has over the course of a generation and a half been very effective at building an ecosystem of think tanks, political leaders, idea generators, language framers, meme makers, and there's no single one that you can point to as the catalyst, but the simple idea of an ecosystem emerging over the course of 30, 40 years is something that, in a way, one must tip their hat to, whatever one's ideological orientation is. I think that when Nick Hanauer and I speak about using the True Patriot as a spark, as a catalyst to light a movement, we have in mind something quite similar. We have in mind an approach, and when I said I take the long view, it is being quite aware of how those conservatives took the long view. When they were politically in the wilderness, William F. Buckley, who just recently passed, had no reason to speak with the confidence and authority he had about the rightness of his views back in the 1950s, when the word conservative itself had just deeply negative connotations in general American life. But they stuck to their views, and they built an ecosystem of think tanks and magazines and political leadership around that. And I would say that progressives have to do the same. However, I would say that this is different from saying Republicans and Democrats. And I just want to end on this note. I have deliberately, I am a Democrat, I've worked for Democrats, I will vote for a Democrat. But whether it's Clinton or Obama, there is a part of me that is hopeful. As we stand here in March 2008, I may be completely drained of hope by August, hopeful that a contest against John McCain can be a contest that raises issues about civic virtue, about the true meaning of patriotism, what patriotism actually calls on us to do, about the match between our words and ideals and the actions or the agenda that we subscribe to or try to implement, and that we can have this kind of conversation. But I would say in the context of that conversation, when I say progressive, and when I say that true patriotism, when you unpack it, is inherently down to the core progressive, I mean progressive simply in the sense that it is oriented toward progress. It is oriented toward more people participating more fully in public life. It is oriented toward more people being able to live to the fullest of their potential. It is oriented toward more people having an equal opportunity and a fair shot to develop their potential. It is oriented toward fewer people having their life chances predetermined by inherited disadvantage. That's progress. That's progressivism. And there are people in both parties who subscribe to this kind of progressivism. And I think it's really important as we think about movement building right now that it not be cast in terms of the Democratic Party equivalent to what has unfolded over a generation with the Republican Party. My personal view is that Democrats will more often be the carriers of a lot of these ideas. But I will tell you that some of our most kind of enthusiastic early readers of the True Patriot have been moderate Republicans who have felt like they've been made homeless by the trends and forces of national politics over a generation. And so I think if we can create a coalition in this country of people who are willing to talk about principle, willing to engage in a discussion about values, willing to harness that discussion to a sense of national purpose, and willing to do so in a way that is grounded not just in the politics of the moment, but in the spirit of what the founding generation tried to do, then we're going to be doing just what this country needs to do. And if we don't, then history will record this moment and our missed opportunities and missed choices the same way we record Roman history and the failure of the Republic, and say that, boy, they sure inspired a lot of people, but then they went off the rails. And the purpose that I find in my life is to make sure that I spend every ounce of energy I have to make sure our country not only stays on the rails, but thrives. Thank you all very much for being here tonight. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to sign books and join in the continued conversation.